In 1968, there was a school teacher in Iowa named Jane Elliott who did an experiment that you might have heard about before. The morning after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Elliott walked into her third grade classroom and made an announcement. Children with brown eyes would sit in the front of the room. Children with blue eyes would sit in the back. Brown-eyed children, she said, were smarter, faster, more trustworthy. Blue-eyed children were, well, less so. Initially, there was some pushback, but quickly she ginned up an explanation, something to do with melanin, making one more intellectually stimulated. Soon, the arguments died away. The children rearranged their desks, and something began to happen almost immediately. The brown-eyed children started finishing their work faster. They raised their hands more often. They corrected each other, while the blue-eyed children grew quieter, more tentative, and made mistakes that they had not made the day before. Jane Elliott had not changed the curriculum. She had changed the children. She had simply pointed out a difference that they already knew existed. Some of them had blue eyes, some of them had brown. Then she attached a single idea to that difference. Better. Within hours, the children began behaving as if this new reality were the truth. What's interesting is that when people tell this story, they usually focus on what it says about prejudice. But that's not the part that we're zooming in on today. Today, we're talking about what happens after the declaration, after the word has been spoken, after the desks have been moved, when the room is settled. Because long after the moment itself, the label is still at work. This is the Whole Parent Podcast. The idea for this episode started with a much smaller question. It began when I noticed how often we use labels when we're talking about our kids. You're smart, shy, confident, cautious, gifted, wild. We say these words casually, sometimes kindly, sometimes clinically, and we assume that they function like mirrors reflecting something that's already true. But there's a concept in sociology and psychology called labeling theory that suggests that something deeper might be at play in these moments. Labeling theory argues that labels don't just describe behaviors, they produce behaviors. Which raises my next question. What if some of the traits that we think of as personality aren't really personality at all? What if they're responses? Responses to our expectations, our narratives, our offhanded comments to the other parents at the park. And what if the most powerful labels aren't even the ones that we say out loud, but the ones that we simply imply? Before Jane Elliott began her experiment in the early 1960s, a psychologist named Robert Rosenthal conducted a now famous experiment in an elementary school. Teachers were told that a small group of students had been identified as intellectual bloomers, kids on the verge of rapid academic growth. What the teachers didn't know is that those students had actually been chosen at random. There was no special ability or hidden genius separating them from everybody else. But by the end of the year, those children had made remarkable gains. Why? Rosenthal discovered that the teachers, without realizing it, had changed how they interacted with those students. They smiled more, they waited longer before intervening, they corrected mistakes more gently. The label didn't change the child, at least directly. It changed the environment around the child, and the child adapted. This is where labeling theory begins to get a little bit slippery, because we like to think of labels as opinions, but in practice, they function more like instructions. Once someone is labeled, they're watched more closely, and the change is immediately perceptible. Which brings us to the next thing that I want to talk about: what labeling does to our nervous system. Imagine walking into a room where you know that you're being evaluated. It doesn't have to be blatant or obvious. You don't need to say to anyone, "We're watching you." Your body already knows. Your shoulders tighten, your speech patterns shorten, and you begin to scan faces for signs of disapproval. We do this because at a biological level, we're staying attuned to the social approval that has always been a matter of survival. This becomes especially problematic when it happens in early childhood. Kids become vigilant, performative. This isn't because they've accepted the label consciously, but because their body has learned the rules of the room. Be careful. Don't make it worse. This is who they think you are. What's interesting and tragic is how quickly that this turns into a loop. Take the child that we label as difficult. Teachers brace themselves before every interaction. Their patience is subtly shortened, anticipating disruption before anything has actually already happened. The child senses this tension and reacts, often with dysregulation. And then everybody nods. See? They say, see? Told you they're difficult. But the label didn't explain the behavior. It engineered the behavior. This doesn't stop in childhood. Adults do this constantly. We assign roles in internal family systems. The responsible one, often the oldest. The sensitive one, the problem child. The black sheep. We assign roles at work. The reliable employee. The wild card. The one who needs extra supervision. And once assigned, these roles subconsciously limit what people are allowed to be. The responsible one can't fall apart. The sensitive one can't be decisive. The problem can't suddenly just be fine, can they? Here's the paradox. Labels are meant to help us understand people, but they often function as endpoints, not beginnings. Once labeled, curiosity dies. We stop asking what happened, or what changed, or what context am I missing. The label answers everything in advance. In fact, halfway through researching this episode, I realized something interesting. You don't even have to agree with a label to let it shape your life. You just have to live in a world that responds to you as if the label were true. Labels are not psychological. They're relational. They don't always change who you think you are, but they change how others act around you, and eventually, behavior adapts to environment. This means that labeling theory isn't about self-conception. It's about context. Who gets patience? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Who gets to be seen as a work in progress? Labels don't lock people in by convincing them that they're something. They do it by narrowing the range of responses available to them. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Entire institutions run on labels. Schools, prisons, healthcare systems, corporations. Labels create efficiency. They reduce ambiguity. But efficiency always comes at a cost. When systems label, individuals absorb the consequences, and the system can point to the outcomes as proof that it was right all along. The worst part is, the most powerful labels don't even need to be spoken out loud. They live in microaggressions. They live in the tone, the patience withheld, in who gets interrupted and who gets listened to. You don't need to tell someone that they're too much. You just need to sigh when they speak, and they'll learn. And these moments accumulate until eventually they shape what we allow ourselves to want. As our environment consistently tells us what's even on the table for people like us. I can't help thinking back about Jane Elliott's classroom, about how fast it all happened, about how a single sentence and a ginned-up explanation reoriented an entire classroom. I wonder how many of us are still sitting in the wrong seat, simply because once upon a time, a label was applied, and the room just adjusted. Hey, I want to pause for a moment and talk directly to you, because if you've been listening for a while, you know that I don't have any sponsors on this show. I have done very few ads. I take the ones that I get, but the truth is this podcast actually costs me money to produce. It takes time, it takes me getting childcare, it takes equipment, and it's something that I do genuinely because I believe in helping parents feel less alone and more supported. It's like social media videos that I make. I don't make money off of those. I don't make money off of my email list. And so if this podcast or any of those other things has helped you have that moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm not failing, my kid's not broken, I can actually do this, and have that confidence to parent consistently with brain-based techniques or evidence-based strategies, I want to gently ask you to consider supporting the show on Substack. It's completely voluntary. There's no paywall. There's no real exclusive content that you're missing out on. It's just a way to go in and make the podcast sustainable. Think of it like tossing a few dollars in a hat for work that matters to you, for conversations that you want to keep alive in the world. If you're the type of person who puts $1 or $2 in a tip jar of a barista that you really like, if you're the type of person who throws $5 in the case of somebody busking that's playing music in the subway, this is that. Except you're doing it online on Substack for a podcast that I try and put out basically 5 days a week, which is a huge undertaking. Every single one of you who chooses to contribute actually makes it possible for me to keep doing this work week after week, episode after episode. So if that's something you want to do, the link is in the show notes. Again, it's on Substack. And truly, I want to thank you just for giving me the time and attention to even consider this. It is the reason that I am able to keep doing this. All of the money that goes into the podcast basically just gets put back into producing the podcast. I do this because I love it and I want to get back to doing that. And so that's the end of my little pitch. Please, please, please consider it. I love doing this work. I love making these episodes, and I want to get back to doing that right now. And maybe the hardest question of all isn't what label did I receive, but which version of me never got the chance to show up because the environment never expected it to exist. Thank you for your time listening to the Whole Parent Podcast today. I hope you got something out of it. I have a couple quick favors to ask of you as we end the episode. The first one is to jump over on whatever podcast platform that you are listening to right now and rate this show 5 stars. You'll notice there are a lot of 5-star ratings on this show, whether that's on Spotify or Apple Music or Apple Podcasts. We have a ton of 5-star ratings, and it helps our podcast get out to more people than almost any other parenting podcast out there. And so it's a really quick thing that you can do if you have 15 or 20 seconds. And if you have an additional 30 seconds, I'd love to read a review from you. I read all the reviews that come through. If you particularly like one part of the podcast, or you like when I talk about something or whatever, imagine that you're writing that review directly to me. The second thing that you can do is go and send this episode to somebody in your life who you think could use it. Think about all the parents in your life. Think about your friends, your family members who could use a little bit of help parenting. It's vulnerable to share an episode of a parenting podcast with them. I get it. But imagine how much better your life is as a result of listening to this podcast, of following me on social media, of getting the emails that I send out. You can share that with someone else too. And so I encourage you, just go over, shoot them a quick text, share this episode with them, or share another episode that you feel like is particularly relevant to them. The last thing you can do is go down to the show notes at the bottom. And like I said, in the mid-roll, you can subscribe on Substack. It's $5 a month or $50 a year. I don't have that many people doing it, and yet the people who are doing it have made this possible. And so if you like this episode, if you like all of the episodes, if you want them to continue, the only way that I can keep making them is through donor support, free will donations to the podcast. Please, 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 as you're thinking about the end of this year, as you're thinking about your charitable giving, I know I'm not a 501c3. You can't write it off on your taxes, but if you'd like to give me a little gift to just say thank you for what you've done this year, the best way to do that is over on Substack. Again, $5 a month, $50 a year. It's not going to break the bank. It's probably less than you spend on coffee every week. definitely less than you spend on coffee every week. Maybe less than you spend on almost anything, right? $5 a month is very, very small, but it goes a long way when it's multiplied by all of the different people who listen to the podcast and sending that over to me. I get all of that money. It's just my way of being able to produce the podcast, spend money on equipment, spend money on subscription fees, hosting fees for the podcast, all of that stuff, email server fees, all that. So if you're willing to do that, I would love it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll see you next time.